To me, everything that hits the room with the patient, as soon as the patient enters the room, is considered dirty. So if you want to put the ones that are like you close with on top of a towel, that's fine with me. Some hospitals will put a towel down and soak it with sterile water, and they'll say, hey, the ones on top, the ones we used. To me, it doesn't make a difference. I'm going to do every single instrument, soak the whole entire stringer, go through those suctions, look at all the impactors, and do that gross decontamination no matter what. Even if I use just the needle driver, I'm still going to look at everything, because what if some before you missed it?
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week, we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal: to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go beyond clean.
Hey there, Sterile Processing. My name's Hank Balch. You're listening to The Processes That Save, this season of Beyond Clean. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about the manual cleaning process in SPD and how manual cleaning means we care. Today's guest is Sean Weir, a member of the Beyond Clean Advisory Group, and we're going to jump into the basics of manual cleaning, but also jump into the weeds, into the nuances about what makes this challenge, even though it's so well known, so difficult to get right in our departments. We're going to talk about the pressures. We're going to talk about the tools, and we're going to talk about the people involved in making this process work the way it should. I thank you ahead of time for tuning into this episode, and I want to tell you to hang right there. We'll be right back in studio with Sean Weir.
I'm Bobby Parker.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
All right, Sterile Processing Universe, we are in studio today with Sean Weir, the Beard himself. And that takes a lot for me to say, Sean, because I got a pretty rockin' beard myself. So to call someone else the Beard, I mean, this is deep, brother.
Well, I go by the Bearded Educator now.
Oh, so. The Bearded Educator. Okay, yes, my bad. Okay, let's get that title right. We'll update that on the write-up for the show with the Bearded Educator. Sean, we are pumped to have you back in the show. I know I was telling you before we started recording here, this show might put you in the number one slot as the most appearances on the last 7 years of the Beyond Clean podcast. So that's a pretty big deal. You must be doing something right to just keep getting asked back.
I appreciate the opportunities.
And speaking of that, before we jump in to the interview itself, just thinking back on the very first live event that Beyond Clean did. This was back, so we launched in 2017. We did our first event at, I guess it was still Isham at that point in 2019. I want to say it was Anaheim, California. It was a myth-busting event. And I remember you and I think, met for the first time in person at that event. You might have came up afterward and said hi. And it's crazy how much stuff has happened and all the fun, like creative, awesome things that we've been able to do together in the last 7 years.
Yeah, I think I don't think it was Anaheim. I think it was San Antonio because I didn't go to California.
Oh, was it San Antonio? Yeah.
I think so because it was the Richard Pan, right?
Yeah, yep. It was. Yeah. That's awesome. So, anyways, we got you back. It is 2024, and we're going to talk about manual cleaning today. There's been a million presentations out there in the space. There's been podcasts. There's been articles. Clearly, it's a big deal in sterile processing. However, we're still challenged if you go into the average sterile processing department today and you're doing a little audit, which I know you've done a ton of in recent years, and you just watch your technicians back there, the average tech, you're likely going to see some issues with the process. Why is this the case if it's such a high priority in education, Sean?
Well, it's a great question. The number one reason is lack of equipment in their department. Whether they not have like a 3-bay sink or have like a 2-bay sink at a minimum. I mean, we can talk about that later on, I guess. Or it could just be that they feel rushed that they can't accomplish the task in the time frame. So, they want to take and cut corners.
I'm curious with that answer. Okay. Because that's not the answer I was expecting. And yet, you went to the, hey, it's primarily, now I know you didn't say exclusively, right? But it's primarily either an equipment issue that they don't have the equipment they need to do their jobs, or they're feeling rushed. They're feeling that time constraint piece. Now, what you didn't say, which I had assumed that you're going to say, is they just don't know.
Well, I was trying to avoid that question. I was trying to avoid that piece.
Yeah, that's good. Well, let's talk about that, though. Do you feel like there is a gap? Because I just said in the intro, right, this has been educated a ton. Like, you can't really take a breath outside of IFUs, probably manual cleaning, maybe instrument inspection, but like those are the top 3 most educated kinds of topics just because they're so critical to the role. And yet you're telling me that may not be the primary reason that we're seeing challenges today.
Well, no, I definitely think the education is a huge aspect of it, because right now in the industry, the educator role is just becoming brought to light as a huge need in departments around the world. So with that being said, I feel like the staff don't understand the why behind the 5-minute soak or the 10-minute soak per the IFU, because when they're learning that, are the preceptors knowledgeable enough? Because let's be honest, can an educator train 6 new hires or 3 new hires at the same time? It's very hard. So I think having preceptors knowledgeable enough to back up the educator is a very key source to giving the why.
So you would tie, if there is a gap in education, you would tie that gap to a lack of the why. So we're teaching folks, hey, push this button, but we're not telling them why to push the button, what happens if you push the button, what happens if you don't push the button all the way, like all those little dynamics that go besides just, hey, do this thing that I told you to do and just do it because I told you to do it.
Correct. Yeah.
You also mentioned the relationship between preceptors and educators. And I think I've said on previous interviews, I was never lucky enough to be in a health system or a department that had an educator. But even when I was manager and director, we were able to make a lot of different roles. We got quality assurance technicians. We even got like a database specialist working with a tracking system. We got instrument coordinators. We never got approved for an educator. So, we relied really heavily then in that case on the preceptors that you mentioned to do the primary training. Either way, though, if you have an educator and then you've got preceptors that are deploying the training, as you mentioned, there's only so much that one person can do. Are our standards for preceptors too low? I don't want to get us off track here because we're talking about manual cleaning, but you mentioned this and I want to flesh it out a little bit.
So I think it depends on how the educator handles the preceptors. In reality, I feel that the educator should meet with each preceptor before they start precepting and set the expectation for what the educator would teach and observe them doing it before they're enrolled into being a preceptor. With that being said, also, I think the educator needs to meet with the preceptor and the new hire weekly, review a checklist of where they're at, if they're on track, off track of what they're supposed to be learning, and see how their preceptor feels about the new hire and the new hire feels about their preceptor.
Wow. I mean, that seems like basic common sense, but I can tell you that dynamic of the check-ins with the preceptor, the accountability piece, and even the mutual accountability piece of, hey, are you enjoying your preceptor? I don't think that question is asked that often. It's kind of like, well, suck it up. That's the one you got, and that's how it's going to be. And then we get into this retention conversation on like, why are technicians always leaving? They last a couple of weeks. They get with Julia, the preceptor, and then they like stop showing up. Is there a problem here with this preceptor piece? You're just not going to find out unless you're asking those questions. I think that's a terrific insight. And I would assume if you're in a department that doesn't have an educator, then the manager should step into that role of the weekly check-ins, managing that dynamic between the preceptors and the technicians. Is that correct? I mean, I don't know who else would if it's not the manager.
If it's a preceptor trying to get checked in, it could be a supervisor who's strictly over that, preceptor. Or if there is no supervisor present, depending on the structure, then manager.
All right. So we mentioned the why behind the gaps are potentially the why behind our training, the gap and the why, as well as you outlined equipment and then the time constraints. And we'll get to some of those here more in a second. But before we dive into the manual cleaning process itself, it obviously starts before it gets to us in the operating room. Speak to a couple minutes, if you will, on the impact of operating staff, prepping our instruments and trays, and how that impacts our job at the sink when it comes time to manually clean.
So from the clean side, or are you talking about from the OR side?
The OR side, yes, sir.
Okay. So, it falls on IP, infection prevention, the OR director, and the clinicians or lead techs to help enforce what needs to occur. Also need to look at the ARN, ST, and AMI guidelines too, right? If you read all those, it tells you how they should send the trays back, flushing out the suctions with sterile water. When the surgeon passes off the instrument off the field, the surg tech is supposed to wipe off or remove residual bioburden, so they hand back a semi-clean instrument or device back to the surgeon when they ask for it again, so it's not still, grossly covered. At the end of the case, again, they should put it back in the same tray and make sure that everything has been sprayed down, opened up, and obviously flushed through the suctions. It is in the standards out there or guidelines out there, but it doesn't occur. And I always go back to saying, why don't they understand the need for this? And it's until you get back to decontamination, they say, well, why don't you clean up my suctions? I'm like, well, I have 5 cars before yours, and now that blood has dried in 30 minutes, and I have to sit there and soak it for 5 or a extended amount of time to help loosen up that blood before I flush and brush it.
You answered part of a question that I'm going to ask you next, which is, what are some ways that they get it wrong? Perhaps they think that they're being compliant or even helpful in the operating room when they're pre-treating, or even let's say restaging instruments as they're coming down into these case carts. But where have you seen kind of OR practice get off the rails in a way that it actually makes it harder for us to start that manual clean once we open up that case cart?
Well, my biggest pet peeve is they restring it, but they lock all the box locks.
Okay. Good call out.
That'll be always a huge no-no in my book, because then how are they pre-treating it? Putting it back into the wrong tray when they think it's the right tray. Or if there's locations like a small surgery center that don't have cart washers, or they don't use a ridge or a cart to transport to and from the operating room to decontamination, they spray inside the Rigipan or they spray inside the case cart, but the SPD doesn't have an actual cart washer, so they have all this post-op spray all in the cart, and the staff are then required to wipe out all that post-op spray.
So what's your opinion on instruments coming back in plastic basins?
So my very first hospital I worked at 15 years ago, they did that practice. And I can remember my first couple of weeks, I was like, this job is just nuts. I don't understand it. But as I got back to decontam, I remember the one tech, she was there for, I think, 3 years. I said, you need to learn your heartstring and separate your heartstring from heart 1 and heart 2. And I'm like, well, what's the point? I started seeing them come down and they mixed the stringers up. And it wasn't hard because they put the vascular clamps in the tray 1 and the regular stringer in tray 2, and it just made no sense. But when you organize it the right way, and you take the time as a new tech to learn your tray and what's supposed to be in it, you can organize it and decontam and save time on the clean side to try and hunt down through, say, 4 other heart pans to find out where the rest of your stringer's at. Yes, there's chipping out there, but I really don't believe in chipping if you don't have to. I think you should just be able to separate your stringers as they're coming to you in decontamination, if you know your trays.
What are your thoughts on separating, quote unquote, used instruments from unused instruments? This will be the last question before we jump into the actual manual cleaning stuff here.
To me, everything that hits the room with the patient, as soon as the patient enters the room, is considered dirty. So if you want to put the ones that are like you close with on top of a towel, that's fine with me. Some hospitals will put a towel down and soak it with sterile water, and they'll say, hey, the ones on top, the ones we used. To me, it doesn't make a difference. I'm going to do every single instrument, soak the whole entire stringer, go through those suctions, look at all the impactors, and do that gross decontamination no matter what. Even if I use just the needle driver, I'm still going to look at everything, because what if some before you missed it?
Yeah. Okay, that's kind of where I am. I know that's a touchy subject for people, especially on the efficiency part. If you're understaffed, you got a lot of instruments coming through and you feel like, man, if I had to look at every instrument, then I'm never going to get through these trays. But to your point, you're making a lot of assumptions in that process that they got every used instrument on that towel, or that someone didn't miss something beforehand and they just didn't see it this time in the OR. And then now it's coming through your hand. So it's not just like a better safe than sorry thing. It's just a compliant quality check that's coming through decon. I tend to agree with you. Okay. As we get to the manual cleaning itself, talk us through as you're doing the training in manual cleaning, or as you're just kind of refreshing experienced technicians. Maybe they've been in the industry, 10, 15 years, and they feel like, all right, dude, I know everything there is to know about manual cleaning. Like, what are those key concepts that you think are really important to drill home when you're covering this topic?
That's simple. Back to basics. One of my hospitals I worked at as an educator, supervisor, I had a tech that was there for, I think they were there for 34 years, and they couldn't grasp the time frame to process a Da Vinci setup. So, I would watch the clock and 10 minutes and they're coming through the window. I'm like, wait a second, that's at least 30 minutes without
you're good,
any.
But you ain't that good, right?
Yeah. So I took it back and I explained, hey, it has to sit for 30 minutes plus the flushing and scrubbing of the tips. 20 minutes go by and there they are again. I'm like, wait a second. No, this isn't working like this. I went back and I physically had to, set a timer, watch them do it, explain them through the whole process, and stayed on this individual for the time frame for the next couple of weeks. They finally, became compliant, but it's really just back to basic and explaining that why, because as we get more tenured, we always lose sight of the why more than just the output.
So I've used different phrases, and I know other folks have probably described this differently that you just brought up, but there's basically a compliance window that it is driven by the IFU. Like you mentioned, the robotic IFU in that scenario, that tells us the minimum time if everything's going perfect. You got no other interruptions, no phone calls, no other priority turnovers you're working on. Like, you're just staying with this one instrument tray through this manual cleaning process. The minimum compliant time window is X amount of time, so that, as the trainer or even as the technician yourself who's processing the tray, hey, if I get this tray through the manual cleaning process quicker in this minimum compliant time window, I did something wrong. I missed a step. I skipped a step. I missed a page in the IFU. Like, the timer didn't work, or the ultrasonic went off early. Like, something was not compliant. So that timepiece, I think, is absolutely critical. What else? As you're kind of introducing people to the sync, you got the timing function. What are those other basics that you're like, hey, in this manual cleaning stage, these are the things that are going to have to happen correctly?
If we're talking about like getting some stainless steel instruments now versus manual cleaning of like cameras or drills, well, it applies to both. You got to explain the rinse, soak, rinse theory to them. And that's where I understand a 3-bay sink and how it functions, but I really feel that the industry needs to go to a 4-bay sink to make it a little more easier. You can have the same 110 sink and remove some of the side shelving and put in a 4th bay sink.
Okay.
To help with the
and what's
steps.
the thought process behind that?
Well, I know is something comes down that's manually cleaned, like a drill or something, you only need 3 bays, in my opinion. But whenever you're washing something, I would love to hear feedback from folks. Where do you pull your sponge to wash it off with? Is it the bay that you're soaking it with? Or you pumping soap onto the sponge? Hopefully not. Or are you pulling it from a half-filled sink of clean enzymatic solution and that sink, and that's all that's in there. So for me, I always teach that you need to have a bay to rinse off with. You do your soak, and then another bay is for your clean, soapy water, as I'll call it easily, that you put your sponge in, and then you could wash, manually clean like a camera light cord, take it to the rinse bay again, and then put it on the cart or into the dryer. Because again, if you're putting it into the sink with what you're soaking with, and you're going to wash off of that with the sponge and the water, are you truly giving a good cleaning?
Yeah, so you're getting into the weeds here, which that's great because clean freaks everywhere just love to nerd out on this kind of stuff. So let me ask you, in your scenario, because you're bringing up an important point, that, hey, there's some assumptions made about the different basings. And this is a debate. This is a live debate, right? So anyone tuning in, this is not just kind of Sean's opinion, like random thought on this. Like there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of conversation about, even back to the 3-bay model. What are those 3 bays? Like what actually works the best? Not necessarily like what's written in the documents or, what's the training guidelines say or whatever, but like what actually works, what doesn't work. And then where are the gaps? And that's what you're bringing up here, Sean. If you've got a sponge or brush, or cloth that you're using, as soon as you use it the first time, it becomes contaminated. And so then the question is, where is that contaminated cleaning tool? Which bay is it going back into? Because if it's going back into any bay, now you're basically cross-contaminating any other device that you're going to be using that same tool with, unless there's an inter-process disinfection, thing going on, like which we're not disinfecting sponges. I don't even think that's possible. But yeah, what are your thoughts? Maybe the better question here to this piece, because this does come up, especially when we're talking about like ultrasonic cleaning, which I know is not manual cleaning, but even on the facility guidelines for changing your water in your manual cleaning sinks, because that is addressing, again, this contamination piece. How do you approach that? And why is that an important concept that could potentially get missed in training?
So I know some people out there will disagree with me.
Love it. Okay.
And that's
louder
okay.
Then.
I think that depending on what you're washing manually, not instruments, manual, like cameras and light cords and rigid scopes, not flexible scopes, rigids. I stuck with a 3-to-1 ratio. And if it's not a lot, I would do 3 case carts. Let the stuff sit on the side that was manual cleaning or let it soak for that time frame. And then I would go do all those. Most of the trays I had only had a camera and 1 scope. So it wasn't like a whole bunch or a harmonic scalpel. And then I would go back and do 3 stainless steel setups and then do all the hand washing. And then every time I would leave the hand washing sink, I would drain it. Now, if the camera or the drill was very bloody, it gets drained right away and I fill it back up. There's no questioning. It all depends to me on the gross, residual gross material on what we're cleaning. Now, again, some people out there are going to say you should drain it every single time. It's just chemistry and water. And I agree also, but I look at, is there potentially waste when we do that every single time? If you're just cleaning a camera and a rigid scope,
rules just say, hey, switch it every time.
Yeah.
Drain that chemical down the drain. Get you some more chemical in there, Sean.
I mean, if you're just doing like a camera and a rigid scope, how grossly soiled is that?
Right. Which, brings up the other point, and I do want you to speak to this. Okay. So that's your hand wash sink, basically. These are the ones that are just undergoing this manual clean process prior to being handed through the window. What about your stainless steel instrumentation that's being manually cleaned prior to going through the automated cleaning process? Are you still doing that kind of 3-to-1 ratio, or do you have a different one that you use for those?
So I don't like how manufacturers have a number associated with a cycle. So if you have a sonic or an agitation attached to your sinks, it goes for 5 times and it drains. I don't like that. I don't think there should be a number associated with it, because when you fill it back up, does it restart? Some manufacturers do not restart back at 1, they start at 3. So then you have 2 small trays that aren't being like heavily gross soiled. You put them in the sonic or the agitation, and then it drains, and it's not even like dirty water. So I think it also goes back to how grossly soiled were those instruments. If the water starts looking cloudy, you're way beyond that. But if I'm flushing the suction out and I get something that pops out, I'm draining the water after that tray.
So you're saying, Sean, that I got to use critical thinking in this manual cleaning phase. I can't just pick a number and stick with the number no matter what. I've actually got to have a little bit of, I won't say experience, but I'll say a level of comfort with that decision-making matrix, if you want to call it, that if certain things happen, you just mentioned a couple of them. If I get a real dirty suction, that's a trigger that says I could potentially need to flush this. Now, depending on exactly how dirty and exactly how much debris and how big your sink is, and if it's first load and everything else, right? I guess there's dynamics there. And this really goes to, and I reference this, but I want to call it out even more specifically for the audience, your facility policy, because I believe the way that the standards are written today is your facility needs to have a policy for your water changes. And to your point, if you're using equipment that automates that water change, it is what it is, but then you should have a policy that reflects what your equipment is doing. And if you have a way, or if your staff is kind of short-circuiting that process or lengthening the process of your equipment, it's got to match your policy. So this is going back to the compliance piece and the auditing piece. Like if you're non-compliant with your policy and you're doing something that's above your policy, that's not necessarily saying that it's unsafe, but it does lead to a different standard of care that then when auditors come in and they're looking at those things, they're like, well, why does Sean change his water every 2 case cards, but Johnny's like rocking on his 10th case card and that water is still hanging out? There's a problem there. So that's why the policy and the practice piece and that training piece that you brought up, Sean, is so important for the water changes. I alluded to this on the comment about the sponges too, but brushes, if you're using reusable brushes, and let me just ask you like what your personal opinion is on this brush process, disinfection process, like reusable brushes. Like, what do you think is, I won't say best practice, like what's your preferred practice when you're dealing with brushes?
So with brushes, I have 2 standpoints. Shift brushes for commonly used brushes, and then you have like 2 or 3 of the same one in that little packet. You go in the morning, you grab that pack, and that's your go-to for majority of your cases. Now then you have your ortho and everything else like that are different sizes. And then I go back to looking at some of the new data out there about brushes, and there's no IFU on brushes, and I understand all that, but should brushes truly be a 1-case practice? And I'm sure the brush manufacturers out there would love to see that in their industry.
Yeah, they're all rooting for you. Go, Sean, go, Sean.
But, you have to look at the aspect. Did you brush through and was it dirty? If it comes out clean, is that really considered a contaminated brush? Okay, maybe they just flushed water through it. I don't know. But maybe they didn't even use a suction at all.
It's a contaminated brush if you use it, but that still doesn't answer the question, can you reuse it? Because we're in a contaminated area anyways. If it's not gross soil and debris, if the brush is not damaged, right? Like all those things, to your point, are kind of factoring into this decision-making process. Yeah, but I interrupted you.
I will say for me, I will use a brush for a shift or until I bend it where I can't use it anymore, which would be like every probably 4 or 5 case cards. Because most trays that I've dealt with only have two or three suctions, and that would be it. So it's not like it's a heavy like crane that has like 10 suctions on it. But
and that's what a lot of the language is out there today. If it's IFUs or if it's training, like they're like inspect your brush, just like you would your instruments, and then look for signs of, bending, cranking, like missing bristles, those kind of things, which, that missing bristle part is scary and important the more complex the device is, especially just get into the endoscope conversation too. So, that's really important. That's not just like, okay, like give it a quick little, okay, yeah, there's still some bristles there, so it's good to go. You need to be a little bit more thorough than that. All right, Sean, we are quickly running out of time, and we've talked a little bit here about tools, but I want to close on a conversation around tools, innovation, training practices that you feel like have been the most helpful in your career. Like, what are those go-to tools, training, equipment that you feel like every department out there should give a second look to?
There's tons of material out there that's free for like the videos out there from, I'll say companies, Healthmark, Sterile, Pure Processing. They all have some videos out there on process improvements and process you should do in decontam. But I think it all comes back down to that why. There needs to be a good video on the whys behind we rinse it off, then we soak it, then we rinse it off, then we move to the sonic, out of the sonic, we rinse it again. I always use the example when I'm teaching decontam on manual cleaning. Would you want to wash something with dirty water and pass it through to someone else, or would you want to wash it with a bait isolated by itself that nothing hits it? And that usually hits home more with people than just saying, well, you need to have a sink full for soaking, washing, and rinsing. They don't understand it. So I kind of break it down into that small area. And when I had to retrain a whole department, that made a lot of sense to 95% of the department when they heard that aspect of the why.
Well, I know I said that was the final question, but you made me think about another question here. So let me ask you one more question. Is there any tool or resource, like you mentioned resource too, but like, is there any tool over the last 5 years that you think has been the most helpful innovation to helping us more effectively manually clean in sterile processing?
I wouldn't say anything new.
Okay. Yeah,
I would say
that's an important commentary. We need some new things.
We need some new things. I love using the Da Vinci hose to squirt out suctions and laparoscopic instruments.
Yep.
That's an incredible tool. I'm a fan of the water gun, but that's old technology.
Right.
I feel like we need lights in our sink bays, inside the sink bay. I'm not talking UV light. I'm talking about just bright lights that help you see what you're doing in there.
I mean, like pool lights, right? Like they can put lights in pools. They can put them in a sink.
Yep. Kind of like having that. And I don't really see a need for it, but like a light table for wrapping. There's so many QA checks with wrap companies that they shouldn't have any slices in it. It's usually done by careless handling or shipping people. But lighting in the sinks needs to occur. And I have $1 million idea that I thought about just now, and I'm not going to say it on the air because someone's going to take it.
Tell me later.
Tell you later.
After we stop here.
Yeah. I think just better lighting and staff know the exact why. I think that's just crucial.
Well, Sean, I think you brought up a ton of really interesting conversation points here. And I did not have preconceived notions of what this interview, like the direction that we were going to go with this. But I think as we wrap here, one of the most important themes you highlighted was how much gray area is still present in this manual cleaning discussion, from what are we doing for the pre-treatment, what's the best practice, what's the most efficient practice as we get in the sink side, like what's your water practice, what's your brush practice, what's your training practice as you're interfacing with preceptors and educators and competencies. All that is still, I won't say chaotic, but it's all open to debate and interpretation still today in 2024. And people need to hear that. Leaders need to hear that. Administrators definitely need to hear that. If you're looking for this black and white, clear answer that we're just executing on these 10 things and everything's going to be compliant, that's not the reality. You need folks in there with their brains on that can think through these challenges and make smart decisions for your department, create policies, give resources, to your point at the very beginning. All of that, just terrific highlights here, Sean. So really appreciate you opening up about all this today.
Yeah, and I don't know that, Hank, and I appreciate all that. I feel like you need to do audits on how the cards come to SPD. That makes a huge stride in making advancements on how you get them from the OR. And if you have a tracking software, make them scan it to decontaminate.
Well, you heard it here first, and I'm going to give you the final word here, Sean. Scan your cards and do those audits. Okay. That was Sean Weir, and you've been listening to the Processes That Save Lives season here on Beyond Clean. I want to thank you for your time. And like we remind you each and every week here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirt.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast app, or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for Beyond Clean in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. We look forward to hearing from you.